before we unpack what is a Mishkan, what was the purpose of it, and all the questions that come with this week's Torah portion, let's start from the very beginning. Let's just talk about what the Mishkan looked like before we get into the text, because the text, really, this week's Torah portion, the text reads almost like a constructional manual. It's a blueprint. If you're an architect or you're a designer, you'll read it well. It really gives a lot of details on widths and lengths and heights and weights and materials, and it goes on and on and on and on and on with it. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the exact determination and elucidation and of all the elements of the constructions, I would like to share with you, first of all, for those of you who may not be familiar, the evolution of the Mishkan. The Mishkan first is commanded in this week's Torah portion. And in this week's Torah portion, we get a glimpse of what the Mishkan is all about. And then we go on and we know that this Mishkan accompanied the Jewish people in the desert for 40 years. This is where they served God. This is where they gathered. It became a gathering place like any synagogue or house of worship is. And then when they come into the lands of Israel, they reenact or reconstruct this temporary tabernacle, this movable tabernacle, but it takes on a semi-permanence in the city of Shiloh. There it lasts for a few hundred years until we get to Solomon. When we get to Solomon, King Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, which in itself lasts for about 400 years. And then following that and the destruction of the temple, and the Jewish people go into exile in Babylonia, they come back and they rebuild the temple. This time the temple lasts also for about a little more than 400 years, and then it's destroyed. And since the destruction of the second temple, we have no temples in Jerusalem. We have no central gathering place that we have elucidated so clearly in this week's Torah portion. What we do have is, as I'm sure all familiar with, is the outer wall of the temple in Jerusalem was completely destroyed except for one part of the western side of the outer wall, not the temple itself. The temple had many walls, but the outside of the western side of the outer wall was there's a remnant of this, and this is what we call the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, and that is, or the Kotel, as we all know it today. That is a remnant of the outer wall of the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash really being the final or the permanent construction of the Mishkan. So I would like to share with you a couple of images to give you an idea of what the Mishkan looked like. Because if we'll go into the text, it's much more difficult to realize in our imaginations what the Mishkan looked like. And then we're going to go into the text of this week's Torah portion and discuss the meaning behind the Mishkan, the purpose of the Mishkan, and also the mystery of the Mishkan. So let me just go with you and just share a couple of images with you of the Mishkan. Okay, it's going to take just a minute. Okay, so let's go to the first image that I'm going to show you now is the Mishkan. I'm going to move away because I'm kind of in the way. I see. Okay, let's move on. So here you see, I'm going to point with my mouse. Here you see in the center is the Mishkan. This is the tabernacle itself, and what you see all around it is essentially the outer wall. Okay, so this is the outer wall. This is the outer courtyard. Now inside here, there's also two sections. One is the Holy of Holies, which is on the most northern tip, and here is the main service. This area here was an area was called the Chatzer, the courtyard. Everyone could come and worship there. As for this area,
we don't see your mouse. We don't see your mouse.
Oh, you don't see my mouse. Oh, that's not good. Okay. I guess I'll have to just use north, south, east, or west. So you see the western wall, the eastern wall. So there was a box in the middle. And in this box, that box is divided into two. And these two parts, one is the Holy of Holies, and one is the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, or the sanctuary. Now, I'm just going to go back and share with you that's the outer or the overall picture of the Mishkan. And this was how it was set up in the desert. And eventually, though, the same formula or the same major layout was something that was carried on from the Mishkan to the Mishkan Shiloh, which was the Mishkan in Israel. And finally, it was also the Mishkan in the Beit HaMikdash. Now, here we go. And we have here that little box that you see now. I'm going to share with you what it looked like from the inside. So we're going to slice it open. Here we go.
Excuse me, Devorah. What was that fountain-like structure in front of the?
The fountain-like structure is what we call the hold on a second. The fountain-like structure is what we call the kiyar. It's the wash basin, which the Kohanim used to use to wash their hands when they went into the Beit HaMikdash or when they went into the Mishkan. And we're going to identify all the items in the Mishkan here. So what we did was we sliced through that little box that we saw. So remember before you saw this big room, this outer big chamber. Now we saw a box at the northern side. This box is actually not a box, it's a very big place. And you'll see that it's divided in two. The curtain, you see the purple curtain, is the dividing wall between the sanctuary being the place where the Kohanim, or the priests in English, would do their service. And then the inner sanctuary where nobody went in, no Kohen, nobody went in there except for the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, on Yom Kippur, on Yom HaKippurim. So only on Yom Kippur did one man, the Kohen Gadol, go behind this curtain. And as you see behind it, there's a box. This box is the Ark, and it's the Ark of the Covenant, and it has in it the Torah or the Ten Commandments, depending when the Jewish people were where they were. So this is the Ark of the Covenant, as you know, the Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's what they were looking for. This is the Ark of the Covenant, and here we see the Shulchan, the menorah, and the Mizbeach. Now, I just want to point out that the drawings that we have here of the menorah, there are discussions about how this looked. The menorah is explained in great detail in this week's Torah portion, but it does not tell us if the menorah was round or linear. And according to Maimonides, the menorah was linear and not round. And the reason why a lot of people render it as arched this way is because of the inscription on the Arch of Titus in Rome, where they have the enactment of the destruction of Judea and the triumphant Romans coming with the menorah in their hand, and that was the depiction of the artist. And because of that, a menorah was always seen as rounded, but according to Maimonides, based on the teachings in this week's Torah portion, the menorah looks slightly different, as does the Shulchan. But we're going to get into that. I just wanted to show you that there's layers of curtaining, and on top you see that there are layers of skins, purple skin, a more neutral skin, a red skin, and then another skin on top. So it had furs and skins when it was in the desert. Later on, when it took a more permanent appearance, it was less fur and less skins. And you'll see here also that there is these pillars that are all around, and the pillars have little sockets, and these are all described in this week's Torah portion. Now, we're going to get into the discussion itself. I just want to show one more image. I want to share one more image with you. Okay, and here are the vessels that are found in the Beit HaMikdash. Again, these vessels The menorah, the mizbeach, but not very clear picture. I'm sorry for that. These are, again, not necessarily according to the menorah being rounded. The mizbeach seems to be the way it is written in Maimonides. But I just want to give you an image of that. And now I just want to share with you another image. And this image is, hold on a second. This image is what the temple looked like when it was built in Jerusalem. So you see that it followed the same, it obviously a much more ornate, made out of stone, but the dimensions in terms of the way it was used is very, very similar, in that we have in the temple, we have the Holy of Holies, so you have the outer box, as you see here, and the courtyard. We have the reenactment of the main design is the same, except that it's obviously much more ornate. This is a reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And then, of course, what we know today.
First temple?
Sorry?
This is the first temple?
This is probably the first temple. The second temple was much more elaborate than the first, and the second temple underwent several renovations. So I just want to, it's, the second temple was more ornate than the first. So it's possible that this is the second temple. I am not sure, I would have to check, but they were very similar. The second temple was really a rebuilding of the first temple. Later on, towards the end of its lifespan, it was renovated, and at that point, it was made much more elaborate and much more beautiful. Okay, here we have the
Sorry,
temple.
in the picture we just saw,
Yes.
we didn't see the western wall there, right? That wasn't included in the picture, just the previous
No,
one.
you're right. It's not, the western wall is not included in this picture. Now we're at the western wall here, and what I showed you before, the box, you see where the trees are and where the mosque is. So where the dome of the rock, or the mosque, the dome of the rock with the big gold dome, approximately there, around there, somewhere there, was the Holy of Holies. Okay, where only the Kohen Gadol went in, and again, it had you saw the picture, it was, the Holy of Holies was extremely elaborate and a very, very high building. And then the rest of it was the rectangular building so you can imagine the sanctuary was more south, and then the courtyard was even more south. So that if you go to Jerusalem, so here's the Western Wall, we recognize the Western Wall. On the southern wall of Jerusalem was the entrance to the temple, the outer wall of the temple. I don't know how many you have been there, but you can see some of the gates were closed off. This was part of the Western Wall, and part of the southern wall still remains. And this was the gate to the courtyard. So we're praying really parallel to when we pray at the Western Wall, we're praying parallel to what was the temple. A couple of years ago, about 10 years ago, I had the privilege of going on a tour where we went through the old section of Jerusalem, the Arab section, so-called, and we went up right to where the Holy of Holies was, very close to it. And we know today where the Holy of Holies are. According to rabbinic law, one is not to go up on the Temple Mount today, because we don't know exactly where the Holy of Holies is. And therefore, because we don't know exactly where the Holy of Holies is, therefore we cannot enter there, because we're not allowed to enter into the Holy of Holies under any circumstances. Now, obviously, there are people running amok on the Holy of Holies there, but nevertheless, we're not allowed to go there. And there are some Jews that have, that do go up there and they pray up there, and it is halachically controversial to actually go up onto the Temple Mount today, because according to our tradition, we're not allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, since we don't know precisely where the Holy of Holies was. We assume it's about where the Dome of the Rock is, just about there, but where precisely, we don't know. And therefore we avoid that area because it would be a contravention to go up to the Holy of Holies today. And indeed, you know, I have to share that when I was in Israel, one of the most poignant moments of my stay in Israel was going to the Western Wall, not because of the wall. The wall is just a wall, and sometimes people feel underwhelmed when they come to the Western Wall. They go, "This is it. This is the holiest site of the Jewish people." But for me, the reason why the Western Wall was so moving was because behind it lay the promise and the possibility, and also the very obvious fact that there was no temple, and the temple was destroyed, and it instead is another faith's temple. And so I found that to be very poignant in a painful type of way, because when you come to Israel, Israel seems to be everything that the prophecies, well, pre-COVID, everything that the prophets promised: children running in the streets, older people living to a ripe old age, watching the children play. This is all prophesized in terms of what will happen when the Jewish people will gather back to the land of Israel, except that the crown jewel of the Jewish people, the Beit HaMikdash, is not there. So suffice it is to say that this played a central role in worship of the Jewish people, in the collective identity of the Jewish people. And in fact, when the temple was destroyed, and not only was the temple destroyed, but when it became very obvious that there would be no possibility whatsoever for the Jewish people to go back to their homeland and rebuild the temple the way they did the first time around, there was a real crisis, in the sense that there was concern that the Jewish people would be completely destroyed by the destruction of their temple. It played such a central role in Jewish life that there was a real concern that there would be no more temple, no more Israel, no more Jerusalem. And so we do have the rabbi stepping in and bringing in prayer, and the prayer is the replacement for going for the temple. And the prayer, of course, could be performed anywhere. And of course, with a minyan of 10 is the proper way to perform prayer for those people who are obligated to pray in a minyan. But suffice it is to say that there was a great concern that all of Judaism would be lost. And in fact, we pray for the reconstruction of Jerusalem and the reconstruction of the temple no less than 50 or 60 times a day in our prayers. So it's always maintained a place in our heart, and it's always stayed really relevant to our purpose as a people and the hope of our people and the future of our people. But the reality is that for the last 2,000 years, there has been no temple in Jerusalem, no Mishkan, no Mikdash, the way the Torah goes through great detail. Now, we're going to be studying the next 4 Torah portions, which really goes into great detail about the construction of the temple and the different materials that were used. And I would like to share a beautiful teaching that I saw from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs that I thought was so beautiful, and it always stays with me. Jonathan Sachs, may his memory be for a blessing, he asked the question, he said, how is it that when we come to talking about the creation of the universe, we have one parsha, we have one Torah portion. The universe is so vast. You know, the galaxies and Earth, the complexity of Earth, the solar system, and all the mysteries that lie beyond it. The creation of the universe is so huge, and there's one Torah portion assigned to it. And yet, when we come to the construction of the Beit HaMikdash, or the construction of the Mishkan, we have 4 Torah portions with great detail assigned to telling us exactly how to build a Mishkan. And mind you, this is a Mishkan that was used for, you could say, all told, a little over 1,200, 1,300 years of Jewish existence. But we have been living as a community, as a people, without a temple for 2,000 years. So he asked this question, and his answer is so beautiful and so poetic. He says that it is much more complex to create a home for God than for God to create a home for humans. In other words, for God to create a home for humans is pretty easy peasy. But for humans to create a home for God, that is very complex. And that's why this type of detail is needed. I thought it was just a beautiful, beautiful teaching from Jonathan Sacks. And it speaks to a certain truism about the questions that must be brought up when we talk about the construction of the temple. And when we talk about the temple itself, there must be some questions that are brought up. And that's some of the things that we're going to discuss today. So I'm just going to get into the Torah reading. Okay, and here we go. Okay, so here's the Torah reading for this week's Torah portion, the Torah portion of Teruma. It starts off with an injunction. It starts off with a command. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Lemor, God spoke to Moses saying. So that's an injunction. And it goes as follows. Daber al Bnei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people. V'yichlu li truma, and have them take for me an offering. Me'es kol ish asher yidven libo, something from every single person, an offering that they are inspired to give. So get donations, but donations that are inspired from the people themselves. And then the Torah elucidates what are the supplies that they need in the temple in order to build it. This we're talking about obviously the sanctuary in the desert, the temporary temple, the one that we saw in the first sketch. V'zos hatruma asher tikhu me'itam, and this is the offering that you should take from them. So what is it? Zahav, gold, v'chesev, and silver, unachoshes. And then it goes on, so those are the different metals. And then it goes on to talk about the different type of materials. Tchelet is a bluish purple material. Argaman is again a purplish material. Talashani is a red wool. Sheish izim is goat hair. Oros elim meudamim, dyed red wool. Oros tachashim, tachash skins, which means it's tachash is not translated, and I'll explain to you why in a minute. The atse shitim and acacia wood. And then what else do they need? Shemen lamaor, oil for lighting, besamim, spices, shemen hamishcha, anointing oil, ketoras hasamin for the incense. And then more, avnei shoham, the shoham stones, avnei meluhim, the filling stones for the ephod and the choshen. And we're obviously, when we get into the actual clothing of the high priest, we're going to go back to these stones that were used. And then the Torah says, God tells the Jewish people, "Va'asuli mikdash," and make for me a sanctuary, "V'shachanti b'socham," and I will dwell in their midst. And then it goes on to explain, "K'chol asher mara oscha," everything that I will show for you, as tavnis hamishkan, the pattern, the blueprint, as tavnis kol kelav, the layout or the pattern of all the vessels, v'chein tasu, so shall you do. I just want to go back and just give you an interesting note. You see that in verse 5, the Hebrew word orat tachashim, tachash skins, is translated as tachash skins. It doesn't have a translation. It's using exactly the same word in Hebrew. It's almost like it's not translated. And the reason for that is because according to our sages, the tachash was an animal that is now extinct. And this animal had a flesh that was multicolored. And this flesh was so unique and beautiful that this was used this what was needed to be used in the building of the Mishkan. And there were speculations amongst the sages of what is this tachash. And believe it or not, some of them say that this is a unicorn, that this was an animal that no longer exists, but it had very colorful skin. So here we have in this week's Torah portion a reference to an extinct animal, the unicorn. Now, I want to go back to the very beginning and ask the question that needs to be asked about the whole idea of building a home for God. In the second verse, it says, Dabar el bnei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel, v'yichchu li truma, and they shall take for me an offering. And Rashi is very puzzled by the idea of v'yichchu li, they should take for me. What does this mean? They shall take for me. It's unclear language. And Rashi translates or explains this as v'yichchu li truma li lishmi, dedicated to my name. They should take a truma that is dedicated to my name. And then we go down a little further and we see that when we talk about the Beit HaMikdash, we are told that God gives an injunction to the Jewish people. And here I'm going to highlight it. And it says, Va'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. And they will make for me a mikdash. They will make for me a sanctuary, and I will live amongst them.
And why is that in the past tense?
Va'asu could be, it's not past tense. Va'asu could be a commandment, and they shall make. So it's not in the past tense, even though asu, vaya'asu would be in the past tense. So if it said vaya'asu li, it would have been in the past tense. Va'asuli is, and they shall make for me. So it is a command.
Right.
It's imperative. Okay. So shachanti b'socham, and again, the same idea. Shachanti could be past, but vishachanti, because it has the vav, so it makes it again in the imperative. So even though it seemingly looks like it's the past, it's really the imperative. So it's a command, and it's an ongoing command. It's a continuous command. Va'asuli migdash v'shachanti b'socham. It stays as an ongoing injunction. And again, the anomaly of seeing here, vayasuli, they shall make for me, or vayichuli, they shall take for me, and then vayasuli, they shall make for me. And the sages ask the question, and they are befuddled by this, that the idea that God needs a home, right? And we go to where Job, and I'm going to share this with you now. Job said about God, Im chatasa ma tifal bo. If you sin, what have you done to him? V'rabu pisha'echa ma tasalo. And if your transgressions are many, how do you affect him? Conversely, Im tzedakta, if you are righteous, ma titen lo. What have you given him? Uma miyatcha yikach, and what does he receive from your hand? Meaning that when we do good, does it really affect God? Or when we do bad, does it really affect God? God exists outside of creation. He is before, he is during, and he is after creation. So how can humankind make a house for God? A. And B, why does God need a house? V'asu li migdash, and make for me a home. V'titein v'yikach li truma, and take for me a donation. Right? So the question is, what is, God needs us? God needs our home. Does God live in a house? And King Solomon, actually, when he was building the temple, he wondered about that. He built this magnificent temple. He took the Mishkan, which was a temporary collapsible structure, and he made it this beautiful stone edifice. And when he built the temple, what did King Solomon say? And I'm going to share with you from Kings what he said about the temple. He says, where's the? Okay. King Solomon prayed as he built the temple, and he prayed that God should shower his countenance on the Jewish people, but he asked the question, and he said like this, and here I'm going to highlight the Hebrew, so you see where I'm holding, where I'm at with my mouse, and the translation is here, okay? And what is it? King Solomon said, Ki ha'umnam yeshev Elohim al ha'aretz. But will God really dwell on earth? Can God dwell on earth? Hine hashamayim u'shemei hashamayim la yichal kalucha. Even the heavens and the heavens of the heavens cannot contain you, O God. Afki habayis hazeh asher banisi. Then how much less and how much less so this house that I built. So King Solomon wondered about that. As he built the house for God, he was saying, can it be that God, this energy that is the force of creation, whose energy fills the world, right, and keeps the world sustained in its creation, is it possible that the heavens, which cannot even fill God, that a home, a building will fill God, right? So this is a question that is asked by our sages, by our mystics, by our teachers about the creation of the temple. And then we go back to Rashi, and Rashi says in this Torah portion, when it says, "Vayikhu li truma," and Rashi is puzzled by the words "yikhu li," Rashi says "li lishmi," for my name, dedicated in my honor, not necessarily because I need it, but dedicated to my honor. So now we go into this whole idea of the temple. And again, we just elucidated and enumerated many of the materials, or all the materials that were used in the Mishkan, including gold, silver, copper, different animal skins, red wool, purple wool, blue wool. And how they got that wool was very interesting. The wool, the purple wool and the red wool was taken from snails, and specific snails that when they were crushed, they gave out this dye. And the purple wool was used for royalty. Afterwards, King David is known to have worn purple garments. Purple is the color of royalty, perhaps because it was really, really difficult to extract. It was highly expensive to extract this dye from these snails to make the color purple or the color blue. It was very, very hard to get, and you needed a lot of snails, and they were hard to come by, and so on and so forth. So we have these rare materials: silver, copper less rare, gold. Even the wood that is used, it's the top of the line wood. It's what the Torah calls atzei shitim, which our rabbis translate as acacia wood or cedar wood. It was an expensive proposition to build this temple. And so here we have this idea of a temple for God that is made with the most luxurious of human expression. Gold, silver, expensive dyes, expensive materials, designer, beautiful. And so the question of what is the purpose of this home, and why does God need a home, and can God even be contained in a home, is really an important question. And does God live in a home? And then we go back to the verse that I mentioned to you before, when God said, "Build for me a home and I will live amongst you." And this is a very well-known teaching. And actually you should know that in the Chabad philosophy, when the Rebbe became Rebbe, one of the teachings that he taught in terms of his actual purpose was this teaching of the Asal Mikdash B'Shachanti B'Sochem. So here we go. We'll see an anomaly right here. You asked a question before, Charlotte, about the injunction seemingly being in the past, and it is actually an imperative. But let's see if we see something else, which is kind of interesting, which is that the injunction, "V'asu li mikdash," make for me a sanctuary, "V'shachanti b'tocham," and I will dwell amongst them, is grammatically incorrect. It should rather say, "Make for me a sanctuary, and I shall dwell in it." V'asu li mikdash v'shtachanti b'tocha, or b'toch zeh, right? I should dwell amongst it. But instead, it says, "Make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in their midst, not in it. So it is, the syntax is doesn't seem to flow in the same style. Asuli migdash, make for me a sanctuary, and I will live in them. You don't live in them, you live in it. If you're making for me a sanctuary, you should live in it and not in them. And so this idea, that this anomaly, va'asuli migdash v'shahanti b'soham, actually, I guess, deepens the question that we already brought up, the question of that can a house of God be built by man that God could live in it? The quest of Solomon, can God who fills the heavens really fill this house? Could he be contained in this house? And the question of Job, can man really give something to God that God doesn't already have? Can we hurt God? Can we help God? So this idea of va'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'socham, and you shall make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell amongst them, actually bespeaks a very interesting concept, a fundamental, if I could say, axiomatic concept that actually makes up what Judaism is and why this teaching of the Mishkan is so important. And the fact that despite the fact that we have not had a Beit HaMikdash, we have not had a temple for 2,000 years, the Jewish people are nevertheless very much connected as a people and connected in the service of God. This anomaly, the idea that God dwells not in it, but amongst us, our sages tell us means that when there is no temple, the physical temple, the temple in the desert, the Mishkan, or the temple in Jerusalem may be rebuilt very soon in our days, that a person has a capacity to make a temple for God outside of those structures. So therefore, what we find after the destruction of the temple, we have the idea of the Beit HaKnesset, or the synagogue. So the synagogue becomes a place where God's presence is manifest and God's presence is felt. But what happens when the synagogues are shut down? The timeliness of this teaching is incredible. It's interesting that when we study the Torah portion, we're always going to find something that speaks to us, to something that we are dealing with at any given time, right? And so this is what we're dealing with right now, right? This idea that the houses of worship, by and large, are hard to come by, or they're very restricted. Even if they are open, they're restricted, and certainly it's very hard to feel spiritual when you're wearing masks and socially distanced. I mean, there was something about Rov Hadras Melech, the glory of the king is contained in the multitude of the people. So that we are again faced with this idea, va'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'socham, and make for me a dwelling place, and I will dwell amongst you. So we have two ideas here. We have the idea of that, where is God? Where does God dwell? And the idea that, can God be contained in a house of silver and gold? Shouldn't a house of God be in a mountaintop with nothing there, or at a beach with nothing there? Not a building that has gold and silver and copper and precious metals and precious stones and beautiful cloth and beautiful materials. So apropos to what we're living through today, it's very interesting that we find in the mystics that they say that not only can we build a home for God in a synagogue, but we can build a home for God everywhere that we are. So any space that we inhabit can become a home for God. This is the injunction that we have in this week's Torah portion. Because God says, make for me a sanctuary and I will dwell amongst them. Amongst each and every one of them, say our sages, wherever they may be. If they create a sanctuary, I'm there. So a sanctuary could be a home. A sanctuary could be yourself. There's a very beautiful liturgy from one of the great Jewish rabbis that says, Bilvavi Mishkan Evna. In my heart, I will create a sanctuary for God. And what will I bring up in the sanctuary? What will I offer? I will offer my soul. What does that mean? I will offer my essence. So our psyches can become a sanctuary for God. Our minds, our hearts can become a sanctuary for God, but certainly our spaces. Because here we're talking about measurements and spaces and gold and silver. And how do we make our space, our home, our office, but especially our home, a sanctuary for God? Very simply. The Kotzker Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, said, one of the things that, the great sayings, the great teachings that he gave was that God is there where you let him in. God is where you let him in. So what does it mean that God is there where you let him in? What does it mean that I let God in my house? It means that if you would think about God, if you would think about spirituality, if you would think about holiness, and you were home, it wouldn't feel like a contradiction. Your home could be a home that acknowledges God, acknowledges your own spirituality. So how do we do this? How do we make a home for God? We imagine that God is present there. And if God is present there, how do we behave? So right away, how do you behave in a house of God? You behave with kindness. You don't use language that's hurtful. You are careful with your expressions. You're obviously, it's not a home that can contain anger, or a home that can contain, God forbid, even violence. In fact, one of the fascinating laws regarding the Mishkan, and then later on the temple, was that there was to be no metal used in the construction of either. And think about this, that King Solomon, and later on the second temple that was built by Ezra and his group, the temple was made of elaborate stones. The stones had to be cut, and they weren't allowed to use metal to cut the stones. In fact, there was a special type of snail or worm that was a stone-eating worm, and they used these worms to cut the stones. They never used metal to cut the stones. There were no metal pieces except for gold, silver, and copper, but no iron. Why? Why was iron prohibited from being used not only in the actual construction of the temples, but even in the manufacturing of the stones for the temple? Because iron was used at that time. It was the number one tool to use to make swords. So iron was seen as a tool of war, and a tool of war had no room in the house of God. So we can take this idea, any type of war, hurtful feelings, hurtful things, anger, dissent, lack of unity, pushes away the divine spirit, pushes away the divine blessing. So what's a home for God? A home for God is a home where there's peace, there is tranquility, there's love, there's kindness, there's compassion, there's sharing, there's spirituality. A home for God has holy books. It has the Torah. It has books of inspiration. A home for God is a home that God's presence can rest in it. And there's a beautiful teaching that I saw, and I do not recall the source, but there is this notion that our homes really are a reflection of the temple, a reflection of the Mishkan. And how is this? Because in our home, we have different vestiges that reflect the mitzvahs that were found in the temple, or the kelim that were found in the temple. One, the laver, I don't know who mentioned it, that, what was this fountain? It was to wash your hands. So part of Jewish ritual is before we eat, we wash our hands. When we exit the bathroom, we wash our hands. Washing our hands is very much part of the Jewish ritual, which actually plays very well again into what we're talking about now. So washing our hands, the mizbeach, the mizbeach is the oven, the stovetop where we cook meals for our families. The menorah are the candles that we light for the Shabbat. The showbread is the challah that we bring into our home, again, in honor of the Shabbat. The Holy of Holies is the bedroom. because there we have intimacy, and that is what brings peace into this world, and so on and so forth. So we have this capacity to bring the physical into the spiritual. And this is really the message of this week's Torah portion, that God, when he says to the Jewish people, make for me a sanctuary, it's not that God, so to speak, needs us to have a sanctuary, but he's teaching us an important lesson. When you will make something for me, meaning, as Rashi says, lishmi, in my honor, meaning for a higher purpose, not for self-fulfillment, not for I'm looking for a word, but I don't have it. In any case, not for self-awareness, but not self-centered. And I don't mean selfish, but not self-centered, but something that is other-centered. Then you bring in divinity. So when we are told that va'asu li mikdash, and make for me a sanctuary, or v'yikach li truma, and take for me a gift, and Rashi says li means lishmi, do it for a higher goal, do it for a divine purpose. We have here a framework, which is this. There are three pathways in life that we know. There are those who are the hedonists that just love everything physical and celebrate the physicality of everything and the enjoyment of the physicality. And there's no denying that in the physicality of this world, whether it is in the bling, in the gold and the silver and the copper and the beautiful materials and the fashion, or whether it is in the pleasures of this world, which are many, whatever it is that is in the realm of the hedonistic, in the self-pleasure, in the enjoyment of this world, there's one path, which is hedonism. I want, therefore I have. I feel, therefore I get. That's one path. And then there's another path, which is asceticism, which is I'm very spiritual, and everything that is material and materialistic repugnates me. I don't want any part of this world. This world is filthy. Desires are filthy. Wealth is wrong. Richness is disgusting. Money is mud. Everything that glitters is temptation and horrible. I want to live in a mountaintop away from civilization, and let me just, meditate on my purpose and God and divinity, and there I shall stay for the rest of my life. And then you have the idea of the Mishkan. What's the idea of the Mishkan? God says gold is neutral. Whether it glitters or not is in your hands. If the gold is there and the silver is there and the copper is there, so that you elevate it and you bring purpose to it and you use it to beautify something, or you use it to finance something, or you use it to give something, there's nothing more beautiful. Is there anything more beautiful in this world than charity, than giving, than sharing your wealth? Is there anything more spiritual? There is very little that is more spiritual in the realm of humanity than the capacity to say, I want you to have this. And of course, Maimonides gives us the 8 levels of spirituality in terms of giving charity. And the highest is what? Job creation. The highest level of charity is job creation. So job creation is one of the most spiritual things you can do, because you're giving people dignity to live a life. And there's nothing higher than that. If I take my silver and I fashion Shabbos candles from it, or a Kiddush cup, and Friday I stop the world and I say the world stops here because there is a creator and there is a creation, and I will fill this cup with delicious wine that you could say stay away from wine because it's intoxicating, but I will fill the cup with delicious, expensive wine, and I will sanctify the time being the end of the week. I will sanctify creation itself by saying there is a creator and there's a creation, and today we don't create. I bring light into my house when I cover my eyes. So yes, you can light on You could light on aluminum foil. You could light with tea candles, and you could light on silver candlesticks. And so we elevate the physicality. And in that way, the physicality does not become an albatross. It does not become something that holds us down as human beings or really corrupts us. Or we don't have to shun it and go to a mountaintop and say, I want nothing physical in my life. I want to be a spiritual being. There's this brand new introduction that comes in this week's Torah portion. How can gold and silver and copper and all things beautiful and all things that glitter and all things that shine be spiritual? Simple, says God. Yikhuli, Rashi, Lishmi, for my name. If we elevate the purpose of our creation, if we make money so that we can give, if we set a table and we invite others in it, well, today we're not allowed to do that, but when we will be allowed to do that, when we can elevate the physicality, what we've done is we we've redeemed the entire earth. There is no greater redemption for earth, because earth is filled with all of these things. Earth is filled with the gold and the silver and the material. That is what earth is. It's found in nature itself. All these ideas, all these things, all these qualities, and all these materials that were used in the Mishkan are found in nature, right? So the dye was found in nature, and it's part of what it means to be on earth. And again, the three paths that are presented to us, the middle path, which is gold. Does gold shine? That's your choice. Is gold an ornament for self-centeredness or for other-centeredness? For others and in direction of others, it's your choice. And then what happens very, very simply is that when we take these materials and we create a place that is spiritual, meaning that it is not self-centered, but is other-centered, it's God-centered, we've elevated all these materials. So instead of them being laid waste, like in the case of the aesthetic that will go on the mountaintop, or where it has actually become vulgar and completely vulgarized in the case of the hedonistic lifestyle, here is the middle path. And that is really the purpose and the meaning of the temple. God is telling us that if I wanted to stay in the heavens, I never would have created earth. And if I wanted to create an earth that was absorbed with selfishness and pleasure, then I would never try to communicate with you to elevate that. What would be the purpose of a world that is selfish and destructive? Rather, I created an earth, and I need humanity to take all those things in earth, mine the gold for a higher purpose, mine the silver, mine the beauty, mine everything that we have for a higher purpose, and then I shall dwell in each and every single one of you. We make a sanctuary wherever we can. And where we make a sanctuary, that's where God comes. That's where God comes in. And the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya says that the Zekol ha'adam v'tachlis brioso. He says this is the purpose of creation itself, that every single person should make in his environment a dwelling place for God. And this is something that is in our hands every single day. What do we do with our space? Do we elevate our space, or do we denigrate our space? Do we allow God in it, or do we chase God out of it? God gave the injunction, this imperative. It's not an injunction for the Jews in the desert, as Charlotte pointed out so beautifully. It's an ongoing injunction, which is continuously make for me a sanctuary. And if you do, I will dwell there. And that's something that has kept the Jewish people going, I think, through all the years. And look at every Jewish home. Everyone, no matter how what their construct is. They'll have some kind of candelabra, whether it's out of brass or copper or silver, whatever people can afford according to their means, or the Kiddush cup or the menorah or whatever it is that we have in our home. We understand that the physicality is not is not an antithesis to spirituality. On the contrary, it becomes a conduct for spirituality. And this idea really is introduced for the very first time in this week's Torah portion. So in a way, it gives, after the Torah is given, we're given the mandate for what we do with this Torah, which is don't live just in a mountaintop and study Torah. Don't live in your netherworld and be spiritual. Bring the physicality of your world and elevate it for the spiritual, and there, exactly there, God will rest. So that is the story behind the story for the Torah portion of Truma. So thank you all for joining me, and I wish you a week that is an elevated week, a week that you all have a sanctuary in your lives. And I just want to add, in terms of this whole COVID crisis, which really forced us back into our homes, working from homes. I'm teaching Torah from my home. I never taught Torah from my home ever. It was always at the Chabad. It was always in a synagogue. It was always in a public place. But this COVID crisis has forced us back into our homes. And in as much as we don't have much of a choice, that we're basically there for a while, there's a silver lining to that, which is we can look at our homes and say, is this home a sanctuary? Is this home a place where God is welcome? Is this home a place where I feel God's presence? And if not, what can I do to change it? Because to be a Jew means that God does not live just in the synagogue. If God lived just in the synagogue, then Judaism should have ended last March. God does not live in the synagogue. He also dwells in the synagogue because it allows him to be there. If you pray and you're connected to God, he comes there. God is not just in the synagogue, and God is not just in the Beit HaMikdash, because if it was only in the Beit HaMikdash, then for 2,000 years we are without we are without a God. God lives everywhere that we let him in, any space that we let him in. And our homes, by virtue of this crisis, by virtue of this COVID crisis, our homes were a place that we have been resent to, perhaps to reevaluate, what is our home like? How is our home functioning? Do we have the peace in our home that we desire? Do we have the love in our home that we desire? Do we have the tranquility in our home that we desire? Do we have the spirituality in our home that we desire? Do we have the elevated element in our home that we desire? And if not, fix it. It's a wonderful time for fixing the sanctuary, our home sanctuary, because we're forced to live in it and we're forced to be in it much more than we usually are. So it's a perfect opportunity to repair that, because nothing is by accident. It's just about a year ago that we started to get worried about coronavirus. So it's now a year that we're living with this reality, just about. And here we are with this injunction. God is telling us an injunction that is a continuous injunction. Asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'socham. Make for me a sanctuary and I'm going to be there. So let's make our home into a sanctuary and elevate our space and elevate our lives through it. And in the merit of that, we should be able to go back to the other sanctuary, which is the synagogues, but ultimately the sanctuary that we all pine for, like I mentioned at the very beginning, more than 60 times a day, is the sanctuary in Jerusalem, rebuilt with the divine presence resting there. But even then, even when the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem, the injunction to make our spaces, our homes, a sanctuary for God never ends. It's an ongoing mission statement for the time of the Jewish people in the desert, and also for all time. And the Tanya says this is really the purpose of why we were even put down on earth, to elevate all our spaces, all our actions, all our minutes, hours into places of inspiration, giving, kindness, charity, peace, beauty, and divine inspiration.